turn to John 3:16. I will say that the message
And we
that
sang
I
this
heard
morning that wonderful and grand old message. I don't know about you, but I never
Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast. This is Jared
And Sean.
and Derek.
And we are bringing the word today, answering your questions right here. And we're super excited. Let's get into it.
I'm so excited.
We have 3 questions today. The first question is, what is the deal with the canon of the Bible and who put it together? Canons? Ha!
Ha!
Number 2, can you be a Christian whilst being a sinner sometimes? And what is worship exactly? Those are our 3 questions. Let's get into them. Jared, number 1.
Perfect. I will kick it off with, what does the word canon mean?
Did we go back to like pirate ships and
No,
naval battles?
it was disappointing to find out that it has nothing to do with cannons, because I love pirates and therefore I love cannons. But the English word canon comes from a Greek word kanon, which is actually the same spelling plus a K and italicized, at least in my notes. And what it means is measure, rule, standard, norm, and later it came to be known as a list or a collection. So when we say canon, we mean basically a collection of books.
That were approved by early church fathers.
So whenever someone says the Old Testament or the New Testament canon, basically means that this is like a consummation, or this is a list of several books of the Bible. And so we have to look at, what does it really mean for these to be canonized? How are these books included? How do we get the 66 books that we call our Bible? Because there were a lot of things written way back when for us to boil it down to these 66. And so when they were figuring out what was in the Bible, they followed 3 key principles to identify what was actually truly inspired revelation from God.
Wow.
The 3 are these. Numero uno. The writing had to be authored by a recognized prophet or apostle. So people that everybody knew about. That way it could be trusted, it could be counted on. And if it wasn't by a prophet or apostle, it had to be someone closely associated to them. So books like Mark or Luke or Hebrews or James or Jude, who had people author them or scribe them for them. The second is that the writing could not disagree or contradict any previously canonized book. So any book that had already been accepted into the Bible as being inspired by God. And then lastly, the book had to pass a general consensus by the church as a whole to make sure that it was truly inspired. So by the time of Christ, the 39 books of the Old Testament had already been canonized and recognized by the Jewish community as being inspired by God. They were divided a little bit differently. There were between 22 and 24 books instead of 39. But that's what Jesus would have had to work off of when we see Old Testament parallels in the New Testament. And around 430 before Christ, when the last book of Malachi was included, was when that canon was closed. And then the New Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament, were completed between AD 350 or 400, so around there. So we have had our Bible for a long time.
Wow. The second question we have today is, can you be a Christian while being a sinner sometimes? I'm trying to understand the question, because the question can be, if you're a Christian, are you never supposed to sin ever again? And the answer is, well, you got to try really hard. But bottom line, as long as we're still in the flesh, we still struggle with sin. There was this guy named St. Augustine, one of my favorite post-biblical homies of all time. And he just talked about how that we all have this tendency to sin, and it's always going to be made manifest as long as I got skin on my body. So I'm going to always struggle with sin as long as I am born into this sinful nature, like Romans talks about. It says in Genesis 6:5 that the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. That everything that man does or has done leans towards sin. It doesn't take a rocket scientist when you have kids to realize that when your kids are born, they're selfish. And you don't have to teach your kids to be selfish, but you really spend most of your adult life or your parenting life teaching your kids not to be selfish. Why is that? Because our kids were born into sin. We're all born into sin. And so yeah, as we read in Romans 3:23, it says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." And the amazing thing about Jesus is he took the ultimate eternal judgment. Now, there's still going to be consequences for bad decisions that we make in this life. And the Bible doesn't differentiate between small sins and big sins. Sin is sin, and any sin separates us from God. But what is amazing is in Romans 3:24, it says that even though we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, we're all justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. That because Jesus Christ took our punishment by dying on the cross and being raised from the dead, just as we inherit sinfulness, we all reap the benefits of the fact that Jesus took our punishment. And so we're under grace as we're on this earth. Now, that doesn't mean Paul continues to go on to say that we shouldn't sin more so that grace may abound. Just because you have grace doesn't mean that you have permission to keep sinning. He says, no, this is to give you a second chance for righteousness, not a second chance for your own selfishness. And so I think the question is twofold. Can I still be a Christian and sin? Well, yeah, you will sin when you're a Christian, but the blood of Jesus covers you from that sin. Can I be a Christian and be selfish and live for myself and try to serve two masters? Well, no. Jesus said no one can serve two masters. You can't serve the Lord and serve the devil. You can't serve your flesh and serve Jesus. Like, you can't do that. And so the grace that is afforded to us isn't necessarily so that we can sin more.
There is one final question, and that is, what is worship? What does it mean to worship?
Well, it's usually singing songs and watching people on the stage.
Whoa, Sean.
Hey, Jared, was my answer dumb?
Yeah. Well, Sean, in short, that is kind of right and kind of wrong.
Yes.
In today's church, I think a lot of people are confused and thinking that the only way of worshiping God is through song. I don't believe that song and singing and playing instruments is the only form of worship that God has given us to worship him. I think that when we go out into his creation and we look at what he has created and we're setting up prayers or we are painting pictures of it or something like that, that would be another example of worshiping God. Anytime we are giving him glory and saying, wow, God, you are amazing. What you have created is amazing. I am amazing. When all credit goes to him, I believe that that is true worship. Not to downplay singing or music at all. But as believers, we need to understand that it's not just at church in a half-an-hour worship service that we can be worshiping God. Worship is a lifestyle. Worship is something that can take place anywhere, whether it's in your car, on a walk, or in church.
So yeah, Jared, that's a great definition. I mean, ultimately, worship is adoration. It's giving thanks to God for how awesome and great he is, for things that he's done, ultimately for who he is. We adore him. We lift him up. We exalt him. I would say, too, that, you're right. We can be challenged in what a worship service is, or what worship is. And a lot of times we equate it to a church service. But reality is worship is a way of life. Jesus challenged us to live with in an attitude of worshiping him in spirit and in truth, that it's a lifestyle. It's an attitude. It's a way that we go about our everyday. I worship God by caring for the sick and the poor. I worship God by giving to those in need. I worship God by, going for a hike in nature and seeing his grandness of his creation. I worship God by turning on some music and singing. All of these ways are worship. But worship is any way that we adore God or we give thanks to him. So, man, go to Michael's, buy like a card making set, and write God a thank you card, man. That's worship. Boom. Done. Podcast out.
Those are all the questions, but there are two important things to address before we go. A, Disney bought Star Wars. B, Walmart owns Value Village. Okay, bye.
Whoa. That's my Mickey Mouse interpretation.